So we're going to assemble the quilt, and to do that you first start by putting sets of 4 blocks together and all the way through the whole body of the quilt, and then you're going to start putting your big blocks together. So you take your sets of 4 and you put them together into one giant block, and that's actually a quarter of the quilt. You have to be very careful of a couple of things. First of all, you want to make sure that your seams between the blocks on the circle match. If they're done perfectly, you don't notice them at all. If they're off a little bit, your eye will be drawn right to them. So you want to make sure that those seams match up nicely. So I've got all my blocks, sets of 4 together, my little sets of 4, and I'm going to start working on my big sets of 4. So I have a seam right here that I have to match up, and I'm going to show you how to do it. The second thing you want to be careful about is after you've done this seam and you're ready to sew across the middle, you want to make sure that this connection is going to lay flat in the end, and I'll show you that as well. So I've got my 4 sets together, and I'm going to put the first 2, and I'll show you how to match that seam. So I've got my pieces, and I've got them lined up on the seam that I want to sew. And the middle one is pretty simple. It's just nesting seams. One seam is pressed one way, the other is in the opposite direction. So I can hook those 2 in nicely to each other and pop a pin in it to hold them in place. So that's not a problem. The beginning's also not a problem. It's just solid. There's nothing to match here. This is the seam that's going to cause us issues if we don't match it up. So when you look at the seam, these are paper piece blocks and they're pretty exact. When I open that seam up, it almost appears that it's matched naturally. So I don't really have to worry too much about it, but I don't want it to slip while I'm sewing it. So I look at where my 1/4 of an inch is, and this will give me a gauge, and I'm going to put my thumbnail right on that spot. And I'm going to open it up and see if it's already matching. And the way I just did it, it does not already match. So I want to make sure that I make them match. So I'm going to slide it over that tiny little bit, and I make sure it looks like it matches perfectly. And then I'm going to hold it nice and secure, and I'll put a pin. And I'm putting the pin in on one side of the seam, and I'm holding these flaps because as I'm sewing along, that's the part that's going to get pushed and make it not match anymore. So if I put the pin in to that part, when I get there and my needle already gets onto this flap, it's going to be holding it secure, and I can pull my pin out. So now, seeing the pins on this side, I can flip it over to this side, and I can pull this down, and I can check, and they're perfect. So I'm going to go ahead and sew this seam. So I want to make sure that it's lined up, and I'm using a 1/4 inch guide on my old machine here, and that's basically it. And crank away. And you don't have to use a very small stitch, but I still like to keep it on the smaller side. I don't have to use as small a stitch as I used when I was doing the paper piecing, but I still like to keep it rather small because I can't back tack with this machine, and I don't want the seams coming out at the edges. And make sure that this is all pushed under here the right direction. And then when I get my needle right on to that seam allowance, I can pull out the pin and continue to stitch on. Just want to make sure that I'm lined up here. Now, in order to make the center lay flat, the center of these 4 squares, I'm going to bring my stitch down as small as I can so I don't have to back tack. And I'm going to stop just 1/4 of an inch before I get to the very, very end. It'll save me from having to pick out those stitches later when I go to match that up. So I'm going to eyeball about 1/4 of an inch. Even if I go a stitch past it, that's okay. I can always pull that out. And that's it. This got caught under there. Let's see how I did. Very nice. I can live with that. So now on to the next 2 blocks. The only thing that's needing to be matched on this is the center. So I have that pinned. And when I get close, I'll take the pin out. Now there's my second 2 blocks. So I just have to pick apart 1/4 of an inch on this one. I forgot to mention that when you're near the center of the block, it's good to be able to get some of that bulk out of the seam. So I just trim those away, and I had forgot to do that. And there's my 1/4 of an inch. Now I'm ready to put the 4 blocks together. And I have this big seam I've got to work on. And it's got a matching seam, and I have to make sure the centers match here and that they're nesting nicely. And on all my blocks, I've pressed them so that the seams that connect them are going counterclockwise. And I'm going to do the same thing for this particular block. So if I would press this counterclockwise, it would go down and this one would go up. So I want to make sure that's the way they are oriented when I go to put it together. So one's down, one's up. And I'm going to hold them together with a pin. And then I want to make sure that this matches. And so that's going to get a pin as well. And other than that, there's nothing else on this seam that has to match on this particular set of 4. And it looks like it's good to go. The seams that connected the 4 smaller squares should also nest, so we are going to match those. And just make sure they're going in the right direction. When I get close to there, I just hold them to make sure they don't slip. Okay, so this is going down, and the one under it will be going up. That's correct. I just brought it down to a really short stitch at the very end so that it won't pull out. So now we want to make the center lay flat. So here's our center seam. And when we were sewing these seams leading up to it, we stopped 1/4 of an inch, or we picked back 1/4 of an inch in the middle. So now when we sew our center seam and we go to open up our 4 squares, and if we press our seams counterclockwise, magically, these little 4 squares lay flat in the middle. Just like that. You can see that this seam is pressed up and this one is pressed over. This one's pressed down and this one's pressed over. And these 4 little squares appear and they're nice and flat. And there's the center on the front, perfectly lined up. And our seams around the circle are lined up as well. So this one's ready to go. So now that I've got these 4 square sets together, it's time to put the 4 big ones together. So I'll start with this little seam and this little seam, and then I'll put it right through the middle and make it one body of the quilt. After that, it's time to add the top border and the bottom border, and I will trim them to fit the body. And then I'll add the side border and the other side border and trim them if they need to be trimmed, and then the 2 orange top and bottom, and then the 2 orange side borders. And then it's time to do the border with all the flying geese. And these are just squares, so I'm going to put all 9 of the flying geese together, the 9 blocks, squares, then I'll attach it to the top, and I'll put the 9 squares and attach them to the bottom. And then I'm going to put these 9 squares together, and I'm going to put the 2 corner units on it, and I'll attach it to one side, and I'll do the same thing on the other side. And then it's time to add the last border all the way around, and we're ready to quilt. Just one seam to worry about on this set, and it's between those 2 pieces. So I'm just going to pin that one. It's right at the beginning, so it should be easy to keep in place. No stretching. And let me just check it. Looks good to me. This one has a couple more things to match at the bottom. It has one here and two here. So we've got to pay attention to those, and I'm going to pin them so that they don't slip. When you're working on a long seam like that, they're easy to slip. Nice. Nice. Perfect. Okay, now the middle seam, and we're all done. The only thing I have to worry about matching is this and this. It's really worth taking the time to match them with and pin them, because if it's even a 1/16 of an inch off, you see it right away. Your eyes are drawn right to it. So I take special care to get these things matched up. Ta-da!